Welcome to the Macmillan Center. I'm Ian Shapiro, its current director, and I'm delighted to be able to host the Right Honorable Raila Odinga, Prime Minister of the Republic of Kenya from 2008 to 2013, as speaker for the Coca-Cola World Fund Lecture at Yale. The lecture was established in 1992 by the late Roberto Guazzetta, former chair and CEO of the Coca-Cola Company and a 1953 alumnus of Yale College. Mr. Odinga is currently leader of the opposition in Kenya, and he was first elected as a member of parliament for Langata in 1992, and he served in various ministerial posts. Mr. Odinga ran against incumbent Mwai Kibaki in the 2007 election, the results of which were close and hotly contested. 2 months of violence in the country ensued before a power-sharing agreement was reached, as a result of which Mr. Odinga was appointed to the post of Prime Minister, in which he served with great distinction. Mr. Odinga has been involved in the struggle for freedom and democracy in Kenya since the 1970s, and for his efforts was detained 3 times without trial. During the 1990s, he worked closely with the International Republican Institute as a resource person for peace and conflict resolution in many parts of the world, particularly at that time war-torn Mozambique, Burundi, and he offered similar support for peaceful transitions in Nigeria and in Zimbabwe. Mr. Odinga has been widely recognized for his efforts in these regards, and he's received honors and recognition from various institutions, including an honorary Doctor of Letters from the University of Nairobi for his role in restoring peace in Kenya following the controversial 2007 elections. He's been recognized in numerous other universities and associations. In 2011, he was appointed as Special Peace Envoy to the African Union following the post-election crisis in Cote d'Ivoire. Following today's lecture, there will be a reception upstairs on the 2nd floor in the common room, to which you will all be invited. The title that Mr. Odinga has chosen for today's lecture is Afro-Optimism. Has the pendulum swung too far? I'm pleased to introduce His Excellency Raila Odinga. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for a very elaborate introduction. Let me begin by saying that I'm very delighted to be able to come back again to Yale. I was here, I was telling Professor Shapiro, over 10 years ago. So I'm very happy and delighted to come back here. And I just want to introduce 3 people I have here with me. One is Dennis Nyango, who is my communication director. And the other one is Winnie Odinga, who is my daughter. Of course, Professor Hino is actually now a member of staff here. But he's been my advisor, economic advisor in the office of the Prime Minister while I was there for 4.5 years. So, and then I have also here Mr. Mbok, who is a lawyer from Kenya who works here in New York. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I was given a carte blanche to choose what to talk about, and I said I will talk about Afro-Optimism. Has the pendulum swung too far? That's the subject of my discussion this afternoon. I want to begin by telling you about an African say. It's an African proverb that says that until the lion learn to write. All the tales or stories about the hunt shall always favor the hunter. Because the hunter will always say how great he was, how brave he was in chasing the lion. And the lion cannot tell you how scared the hunter was in his presence. So unless and until the Africans begin to tell the African story will be told by others. It will be told by the CNN, by the Times of London, or Washington Post, by the BBC, and so on, all who will be more interested on stories like malaria, HIV/AIDS, bilharzia, ethnic conflicts, military coups, Ebola, and so on. And they will not tell you about other positive stories about the African continent. But I want to begin first by saying that Africa's emergence as an economic force is no longer an expression of hope or just a matter of faith. It is a fact. I therefore feel honored to discuss this subject with you only weeks after this country hosted the largest meeting ever between the African heads of state and government and the US government. At the US-Africa Summit in Washington, D.C., President Obama said, and I quote, "As Africa continues to face great challenges, we are also seeing the emergence of a new and more prosperous Africa," unquote. The president was right. So much has changed between March 2000, when the Economist magazine declared Africa as a hopeless continent. And that was in 2000. And then 11 years later, in December 2011, the same magazine proclaimed Africa rising and said is now with a real chance to follow in the footsteps of Asia. So from 2000 to 2011, that is the pendulum I'm talking about. First, in 2000, the Afro-pessimists were very much on the ascendancy. I want to begin by confessing that I'm an Afro-optimist as opposed to Afro-pessimists. The Afro-pessimists are those who actually follow the line that was being postulated by the Economist magazine then, that Africa is a hopeless case, a basket case, the people who are just need to be sympathized with, that Africa has no hope of ascending. And the Afro-optimists are those who believe in the ability of the African people to develop Africa. Now, the question is, of course, how far has the pendulum swung? Because now you find Afro-optimists are upbeat and so on. But I'm still being cautious. That's why I'm saying maybe the pendulum has swung too far. Africa's challenges are in the public domain. And I want to use a few statistics to demonstrate what I'm talking about. Africa would say that only 1 out of 4 Africans have access to electricity. Africa is a net importer of food, despite its endless swaths of rich agricultural land. Millions of women and children die every year from preventable diseases. Wars or attempted coups, refugees, and disasters like, for example, floods, drought, continue to stalk Africa. Unemployment continues to breed extremists that threaten the stability of many African nations. Negative ethnicity is overwhelming the national aspirations. So with so much gloomy data, where is the hope? I say that hope is everywhere. Despite the presence of the old habits and old troubles, change is taking place at a dizzying pace all over Africa. Today, 6 out of 10 fastest growing economies in the world are African. In most of the past 10 years, Africa has grown faster than East Asia, including Japan. Secondary school enrollment in the sub-Saharan Africa grew by 48% between the year 2000 and 2008. Malaria deaths in some of the worst affected countries declined by 30%, and HIV infections have dropped by up to 70%. Life expectancy across Africa has increased by about 10%, and child mortality rates have been falling in most countries. Over the past 10 years, real income per person has increased by more than 30%. In the previous 20 years, it shrunk by nearly 10%. Over the next decade, Africa's GDP is expected to rise by an average of 6% per year. This is partly due to the foreign direct investment, improved management of public resources, and political stability. The FDI rose from $15 billion in 2002 to $37 billion in 2007 and to $46 billion in 2012. Africa's population is set to quadruple to about 4.2 billion people this century. That means that about 40% of all humans will be African. 70% of Africans are under the age of 30. Well, we could reap a massive demographic dividend from this bigger and younger labor force. The population boom could also undermine economic growth. It all depends on what we do today. Because as you know, youth can be a blessing, but it can also be a curse, depending on how you use that youth. I will talk more about that later. The continent is reforming to do business with the world. The World Bank's 2014 Doing Business report says that 66% of countries in Africa enacted at least one reform last year, compared to 33% in 2005. 9 African countries are among the top 20 most improved in terms of business regulations since 2009. The 9 are an odd mix of nations that the world once gave up on. Those we never saw coming and those we always thought would lead Africa's renaissance. And these are Benin, Burundi, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and Togo. Nearly all these African countries are no more than a decade old, out of the civil wars and crushing dictatorships. Africa is slowly overcoming the communication breakdown that long held it down. From decades of non-performing state-owned post and telecommunications corporations, Africa today has 3 mobile phones for every 4 people. That puts it at par with India. In Kenya, the mobile phone penetration stands at 80% for the people over 15, the highest in Eastern Africa. This has spurred the world-famous money transfer service, the M-Pesa. This is a Kenyan invention and contribution to the world. All this is mobile money transfer. All this is happening before the continent begins to reap from the massive oil and natural gas resources which have been discovered recently. At least 12 African nations, Kenya included, are likely to become new high-level oil producers and exporters. Estimates are that more than 25 billion barrels of oil will become available for export in Africa over the next decade. Commercial viable oil sources have been found in Senegal, Gambia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ghana, and Sao Tome and Principe. It is projected that the U.S. will import 25% of its oil not from the Middle East, but from West Africa in the coming years. In East Africa, it is estimated that about 9 billion barrels of oil and gas will be exploited in the next decade. Uganda is expected to produce 3.5 billion barrels. Kenya and Tanzania will each produce up to 3 billion barrels, while Ethiopia will produce at least 500 million. These developments have not happened in a vacuum. They are products of progress on the political front, our democracy dividend. Africa has had 22 competitive elections in 2012 alone. Since Benin set the trend in 1991, Africans have changed the governments through the ballot at least 30 times. However, challenges remain, and it is to these challenges that I'm going to turn now. We have not invested enough in value addition so that we can stop exporting raw products like coffee, oil, and iron ore. You see, Africa has been a major producer of raw materials to the world for a very long time. And this started during the colonial days, and it has continued even up to now. But what we are talking about is that these economies will not achieve sustainable development until they embrace value addition. Until, for example, instead of producing just crude oil, that we also develop petrochemical industries. Instead of just exporting iron ore, we produce steel and export steel. Instead of exporting bauxite, we produce aluminium and export aluminium and so on, with copper and so on. We have not invested enough in manpower development and information technology as drivers of growth. We need to ensure that regular multi-party elections and economic progresses translate into good government and respect for the rule of law. You know, you actually divide development in Africa into 2 phases. Phase 1 is immediately out in the independence and post-independence development up to 1990. You see, most of these ex-colonial colonies acquired what you can call multi-party systems of government. But immediately after independence, some new schools of thought developed that multipartyism was alien to traditional African society, that adversarial system like the Westminster type was not African. The founding fathers of African independence, Kwame Nkrumah, Leopold Sedar Senghor, Mwalimu Nyerere, Kenyatta, and so on, all argued that multipartyism was un-African, that traditional African society provided for resolution of differences and conflicts through dialogue. Senghor even put it in a book. It's called Palaver. That Palaver, people sat under a tree and discussed and then came to a consensus. So they say that this arrangement between opposition and government was un-African, and that the gigantic task of nation building required consolidation of efforts, that multipartyism was therefore a luxury which young African countries could ill afford. So through a series of measures, coercion, bribery, blackmail, and so on, the opposition was led into extinction. And with it went checks and balances. Corruption set in, and so on. And then that is what called for what he called the second liberation of Africa, the struggle for change. It happened that around that time, there was the Cold War, the fight against communism. So the West had developed an attitude that if you say that you are an ally of the West in the war against communism, then nobody bothered how you are running your affairs within your own country. Tolerate it. That's how we developed these African dinosaurs. The strongman syndrome, Monsieur le Président. So constitution was changed and centralized power in the institution of the presidency, which became so powerful that it emasculated all other institutions of government. So we had people now like Idi Amin Dada of Uganda, who could massacre hundreds of thousands of Ugandans, but was still the chairman of the Organization of African Unity. The people like Mobutu Sese Seko, Kungu Wazabanga, could kill his opponents in Congo, still sit on a 747 presidential jet and was received here at in Washington. People like Jean Badel Bokatsa could convert a republic into an empire and crown himself as an emperor using hundreds of millions of dollars of public funds. And on a Sunday, he would go and raid a prison and flog prisoners. And still he was there as the head of state and a member of the Organization of African Unity. Kamuzu Banda could announce publicly on the BBC radio that against his opponents, Chiume and Chipembere, that if they dared set foot in Malawi, there will be delicious meals for the crocodiles on River Zambezi. That's where we're coming from. I'm just giving those examples to tell you where we're coming from. But things have changed because came the Berlin Wall. When the Berlin Wall fell, the wind of change that was blowing in Eastern Europe also began to blow on the African continent. And through a combination of external and internal factors and efforts, the single party rules, the individual rules, and the military dictatorships all came to an end. So that is then when a new phase started. So you can consider the phase from 60s through to 90 as wasted years in the continent. What I've talked about, the new progress that has been made after that period. Because before that, African economies were basket economies, depending on foreign aid which was pumped into Africa without anything to show for it. But immediately after that is when most of the African economies have registered growth from that period. But I've talked about multipartyism. Then we still need to ensure freer societies, separation of powers, independence of the media and judiciary, devolution of power and resources, restriction on presidential power, and respect of the term limits. We also need far-reaching economic reforms to address the fact that as the economy has grown, so has poverty and inequality. We must begin paying attention to people struggling at the bottom of the ladder and to building strong foundations for broad and inclusive growth. Because, as I mentioned, that a number of African economies are now growing very fast. But it would be fallacious to just be flaunting figures, rate of growth, without addressing how that growth is distributed within the society itself. Because you have some of the most unequal societies in Africa. A very small, very high, very rich, and those which are below the ladder who are very poor. Growth ought to be reflected in the human and physical development of our citizens. Gainful employment, increased wages, job security, food security, better health, and education for all. You have to ensure that all children can access quality education, which in turn will enable them to compete for high-paying jobs. I talked about the youth, that most African societies are relatively young societies. In Kenya, the census of 2009 showed that 72% of the population are below the age of 35. A relatively young society, and that is across Africa. This is in contrast to Europe and even the United States here, which are basically aging societies, where you've got a smaller population, a younger population carrying a bigger population, which is aging. Now, the youth, as I've said, can be a curse or a blessing. If the youth are empowered, then they can be a source of wealth creation. If they are not empowered, then they will remain delinquents, drug addicts, and criminals. Therefore, they become a burden to the society. Now, what we need to do is to empower this youth through education, right from the nursery through primary and secondary education, and impart skills so that they can be a source of wealth creation. This is what China has done, so that China became the factory of the world, because the youth were empowered, they were very skillful, and this attracted a lot of foreign investments into China because of the cheap labor. My friends in Germany, I was in Germany even 10 days ago, I studied in Germany, know that it is cheaper to produce a Mercedes-Benz in China and ship it back to Germany than produce it in Stuttgart. That's why you have Mercedes there, BMW is there, Ford is there, the AMC is there, Toyota, everybody is there in China. So this, now we are seeing that China is becoming more affluent. And therefore, China is no longer the cheap labor destination because the wages in China are now higher. And therefore, China is leaving a gap beneath which Africa can fill under there. And I see that is an opportunity which you need to make use of. We need to invest the proceeds of growth in social safety nets that protect the poor, the vulnerable, and the middle class. We need to support a free market economy. But this must not take away the sacred duty of government to ensure citizens have social security. We are wanting in infrastructure, especially power and roads. With electricity and roads, the possibilities are boundless. About electricity, because electricity, in my view, is the nerve center for the economy. And Africa produces very little electricity, most of it in South Africa. I was, as a prime minister, before I became prime minister, I had been a minister for energy. And I introduced a policy of making rural electrification and infrastructure. But as a prime minister, I was a guest of the French government and had a discussion with a French minister for energy, water, and high seas, Monsieur Balou. And while I was having a discussion with Monsieur Balou, he surprised me. He told me, Mr. Odinga, Africa is a dark continent. I asked him, what does this man, what do you mean? Because, we have been fighting the description of a political dark continent. He told me, I'll show you how. So he produced an atlas. He showed me, look, this is how Europe looked like at night from the satellite. So you could see the European city lit, all the places there, light everywhere. Then he produced another map. He said, this is how Africa looked like at night from the satellite. In Africa, you could see some light in the south there, and then nothing else, and later into Egypt there, but nothing else in the rest of the continent. So he said, when Europe is working at night, Africa is dead asleep. No wonder you have a very high rate of population. That's all that. So I said, look, this one here, I can talk about a political dark continent, but this one here is a reality. And the only way to deal with it is by lighting Africa. And he started what we call Paris African Initiative, where we are working how to help African countries to deal with green energy issues. Africa has got an abundance of solar energy potential around, of wind energy, and hydro, which are not being used properly. And Africa has not been able to benefit from the climate fund, which is available. And this will be concluding with, seeing an area where I see the Yale University actually working together with Africa in this field of green energy. There's need for more action to ensure the flow of FDIs to finance Africa's infrastructure deficit. Here, I can mention what I usually call the elephant in the room, which is China. Everybody talks about China. Now, I've been saying that China is in Africa not to help to develop Africa. China is in Africa for Chinese own strategic self-interest. And every country acts usually in its own strategic self-interest. So says China is filling a vacuum which has been left away by traditional African traditional partners in developing Africa's infrastructure. It's helping Africa to develop the ports, the railways, the roads, the airports, in exchange for Africa's raw materials, and so on. So it is not like it's something that is altruistic to basically just help Africa. Now, we have not done enough to rein in the cancers of corruption, tribalism, nepotism, and patronage. You know, tribalism, I say, is usually a disease of the elite. The elite, in competition for scarce resources in the country, resort to their ethnic origins to discriminate against their fellow elites. And this is, but this has been confounded by the history. Like it is more found in former Anglophone, in the Anglophone Africa, more than Francophone. Because the British, in pursuit of their policy of divide and rule, at the sunset of their rule, were trying to bring communities against each other. And that is what has actually survived even the post-colonial era in Africa. But also it has to do with the leadership that took over power in most of these African countries. But I have mentioned also the consolidation of power after independence, when the opposition was extinguished. Then there were no checks and balances in the system, and corruption became center stage. And the leadership surrounded itself by the elite from its own ethnic community. So corruption became a vogue, order of the day. Corruption, by the way, exists virtually everywhere. The oldest crime, even even you find it in the Bible. But even in this country, there's corruption. The only difference is that if it is detected, then something is done about it. So I'm talking about systemic corruption, which you found in some of the African countries. So we say it's something that we must confront directly, because corruption diverts resources from the public coffer to private hands. And it must be managed. I keep on giving an example of an African minister of roads who went on a tour to visit was invited by his Malaysian counterpart to visit Malaysia. So when he went there, he was taken around the country, he was shown around the roads. And the roads were very well done. Very well, highly tarmacked, nice dual carriage highways. In the evening, he was invited for dinner in the residence of his host. And when he came in, the compound was a 1 acre compound, nicely done lawn. There was a nice swimming pool. And inside the house, the lounge was nice sofa set. Everything was neatly done. So he asked his host, how did you achieve all this? And the host took him to the balcony and showed him a highway somewhere. He said, do you see that road there? Yes. He said, 10% here. So 1 year later, it was the turn for the Malaysian minister to pay his African minister a return visit. When he went, again he was taken around to look at the roads, and the roads were in very poor state. Even those which had been tarmacked were potholes. Some of them were earth roads. Then in the evening, he was invited for dinner at the residence of his host. And when he came in here, he found it was a 5-acre compound. And next to it, there was a golf course. And then inside here, there was an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Then the sofa sets were all imported from Europe. The China was all imported, very expensive. So he asked his counterpart that, how did you achieve all this? He was taken to the balcony. And he was shown that road there. The Malaysian could see no road. Then the gentleman said, 100%, yeah. That is the difference between the levels of corruption. I would say that Africa is losing 148 billion annually because of corruption. The amount is equivalent to 25% of Africa's gross domestic product. Corruption is responsible for the increase in the cost of goods in Africa by 20%, as corrupt public officials receive between 20 and 40 billion in bribes annually, which is equivalent to 20 to 40% of official development assistance. We must tackle inequality as a matter of priority. Inequality and lack of opportunities for those at the bottom threatens the future of everyone and can actually bring down nations. Without attention to the issue of equity, growth will continue being mistaken for progress, and Africa's journey to the future shall remain uncertain. There are some disturbing signs in this regard, and we can see, I've seen some of these wars in Central African Republic, in Mali, South Sudan. Then we had the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt. But I want to say that we generally remain hopeful that despite some of those setbacks, a lot of progress has been made on the continent, and a lot still requires to be done. Finally, Africa's future must be the responsibility of its leaders and its citizens. Africa has changed, but Africa must continue changing. The change must be fast, broad, and deep enough to match the rest of the world and the expectations of our young people. Experiences of the past 20 years have shown us what works and what does not. So we have a reason not to fail again. It is my hope that the relationship which we are cementing with the U.S. Will be beneficial, as it has been to both countries, and that this is not going to be just a scramble and competition for resources. We hope for a true partnership that carries both Africa and the U.S. forward, that as has been the case in the past. But let me finish the story by, again, reciting a story. I told you about the lion at the beginning. But what I'm talking about here is the story of the African lion. And this is a message of the African lion to the Asian tiger. But you, Asian tiger, have danced on the stage for far too long alone. I have been asleep in the equatorial forests. The European bear retreated to the North Pole a long time ago. And the American bison or buffalo is rushing into the Atlantic and the Pacific. But I am now awake as the African lion. And I don't want to let you continue dancing alone on the stage. I'm bounded by the mighty rivers Nile, the Congo, the Gambia, the Niger, the Limpopo, and the Zambezi. I've been sleeping in the huge equatorial forest of the Congo. I'm sitting on the African gold, African diamond, the African bauxite, the African oil, the African iron ore. I have what it takes to rise up and be as great as you are. And I will not let you dance alone on this stage. And before we are long, I'm going to be sufficiently strong to be with you on equal par. That is the story of the African lion. Thank you very much.